Hey everyone, welcome to the latest stream of React 2025. Today we're going to be talking about doing authentication with Firebase to lock down our API routes and only show the sites for the given user that's logged in. And finally, we're going to redirect to our dashboard page showing the list of sites if the user is already logged in. And if we have a little bit of extra time, we will jump into incremental static regeneration because I've seen some people leaving comments, but it won't show up unless we do a rebuild, and this will help solve that problem. So here's the outline for today. Just going to cover a couple of the things that I talked about, and something I've been trying is an app called Linear that I'm going to be using to manage all of the different tickets or tasks that I'm working on. So I'm tackling a couple off the list here today. It's basically like Jira. This is going to help me keep track of all the different things that need to be done. So first things first, I want to start looking at only showing the routes for only showing the sites for a user that is logged in. So if you go to fast feedback right now and you go to the dashboard, even though I'm logged in as myself, I'm seeing sites that other people have added. Obviously, we don't want this, right? We only want to see the sites that we personally have added. So we're going to change our API route to get the sites so that it only fetches the sites for yourself, your own user. And in the process of doing that, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a secure way so that you can't fetch somebody else's sites. Right now it works that way because we haven't locked it down, but once this would get into production, we would want to make sure that only you could fetch your own sites. So to start with that, I want to pull up our auth file where we were doing Firebase authentication and hooking up our user. And we need to inspect the payload that we get back to figure out where the JWT is. One thing I want to mention too, you'll see some changes in here. I just updated some of the verbiage on this homepage because there was basically nothing there saying what this is. So this will help people who stumble onto the site kind of understand what is going on here. So that's really all that is. I have our application running locally, and in our auth file, I want to figure out where the token is stored so that we can use that and forward that JWT or JWT along to our API route. Now, if you've never heard of a JWT, it is a JSON web token, and it is a standard format that we can use to securely send information between two parties. This website's pretty neat because you can kind of paste in your JWT and it will decode it for you and show you what is inside of it. And Firebase authentication uses JWTs. So inside of our auth file, if I go to my dashboard, what I want to do is just see what information I'm working with here on the raw user. And I know that the token is in there somewhere, the JWT, and I want to use that to then store that in state and then eventually send that to our API route. So I'm just going to save this off, pull up our console, and let's refresh the page here. Okay, so this is the raw user that we're getting back from Firebase authentication, and we want to get the JWT out of here, and I believe it is called XA. So if we take this, and I'm going to actually see if, I haven't tried this, but we'll see if we can decode this on that website and see what we're working with. It's loading. I think there were some quotes in here too. Okay, so this is the encoded JWT that we're receiving back from Firebase authentication, and this looks good. This has information about me as a user so that we can securely communicate between the client side and our server side. So when we send this over to our server side, we're going to use a helpful function from Firebase to make sure that I am who I say I am. So if we go back to our local host here, basically what we want to do is add this to where we format our user. So let's just go down here and we will say that the token is going to be the user.xa. So now on our formatted user object, we have access to that token. But one thing I will say is we don't necessarily want to save that off to our database. And right now we're getting this user back and create user is saving it off on the database. Instead, what we want to do is get the token, and we're not going to use it, but we're going to pull it off of that object. And then if we spread the rest of the object and we say this is the user without the token, we can now save off just the user without the token to the database. The reason we're doing this is because we want the user with the token to have on our local state so that we can forward it to our backend. So that looks good to me. We now on state should have access to that token. If we go to our, excuse me, our dashboard page, inside where we are making our call to the backend using SWR, what we want to do now is include that token alongside the request so that our API route at API sites also has access to that information. So this format and this syntax, if you want to send over another value alongside of the sites, is we can get rid of this and say only if we have a user, so only if we have auth.user, we want to call API sites, but we want to send multiple pieces of information along with this request. And with SWR, we can do that by making this into an array and making the second value the token that we have on that user object. Now just to clean this up a little bit, let's destructure user off of this object, and we can remove that and make that a little more clean. So we pull the user off of state. If we have a user, we're going to call our backend and pass along that token. Otherwise, we're not going to make a call. And this will forward that information along. The last thing we want to do is update this fetcher function that passes that information over. So we included the token. Let's go into our fetcher. It's part of our utility. And right now, we're just spreading all these arguments and we're passing them all into fetch. But we want to have a URL as well as a token now. And inside of fetch, instead of spreading everything, the first argument is going to be the URL that we want. And then we're going to be a little bit more verbose on what we want to send to our backend. So we're going to do a GET request. We are going to send over that token as a header. So we'll do headers, new headers. And the first key inside of here will be the content type, which is going to be application JSON. And then the second will be that token. So this header then will forward that JWT as a token on to the back end. And the final piece here will be with cores. We want to make sure that this is a same origin request. That looks good to me. Yeah. Let's save that. I'm just going to clear this. And let's go back to our sites endpoint. So right now we're not doing anything with this first variable, of request. But what we want to do is start utilizing this, and on the request variable, we can pull off the headers. And on those headers, we're going to have access to the token. So let's just take this, and just to demonstrate, we will do console.log. We'll refresh the page over here, and we see all of the headers get logged out here in the console. Hopefully my screen share isn't blocking that, so you can still see those headers. Perfect. Yep, so we have the token on the header, and we're going to want to use that to verify our connection with Firebase. So we could just say we want to pull off this token, request.headers.token. And the piece that is missing here is the verify ID tokens function from Firebase. So I hadn't used this before, and I just started to look into this, and it's very interesting. Basically, it allows you to verify that who you say you are is who you actually are. So when you sign in on the client side, you then forward over this JWT to your server side, and from there, you can get the user ID from it and then use that user ID to do all sorts of different things. For our example specifically, given that user ID, we want to get all the sites specifically for that user. So the way this works is on our Firebase object, we're going to call auth, and then we can get the current user and get their ID token, or we can just verify the ID token that we already have. So if you remember when we first set up our Firebase admin database, what we did was we exported the Firestore by default. And what we want to do now actually is do admin.auth. So what we can do here is just say auth will be admin.auth, and Firestore will be admin.firestore. And then let's export them both instead of just choosing one. This is going to require us to update a couple places where we called this code. So let's just do a quick search for Firebase admin. So for example, inside of this file, we were calling Firebase admin doing the default export. Now we're going to want to get the named export of Firestore. I might make this even shorter. We'll just do database. Yeah. So now wherever we were calling Firebase in these two places, let's update that to be database. Okay, that's one. There is another. And one more. Okay, that looks good. So now inside of Firebase admin, we're exporting the auth object, and we can use that back here inside of our sites API route. And actually, we don't even need this DB inside of here now. So we could do auth dot verify ID token, and then we can pass in that request dot headers dot token. Now this value should give us back the user object, and specifically we want the user ID from this. So first things first, let's just make sure this is working. We'll just log out what this user object is that we get back. need to await that. Awesome. So that worked very, very well. We get back our user object, and you see that we have the UID field on here that we can utilize. And let's just destructure that directly. Now, given this user ID, we want to forward it along and get sites for a specific user. So we're probably still going to need this function to get all of the sites when we are making all of the dynamic pages. So for each site, we want an individual feedback page. So we don't necessarily want to get rid of this, but what we do want to do is take this and do a similar filter like this. So for get all sites for, let's do get user sites. And this will take in a user ID. So for the collection sites where the author ID, I believe it is in the database, is equal to the user ID, get those sites and then return here. Now, one other thing that I just realized is that inside of this function, previously we were doing our try catch inside of here. What we're probably going to want to do is move this into the API route. I haven't totally decided the best structure for this, whether I want to do some kind of API middleware that wraps the entirety of these functions. It probably depends on how many API routes I have. But the reason for this is we're going to need to wrap verify ID token in a try catch in case that throws some kind of error. So rather than doing this, we can move this directly inside of here. So if either verify ID token or accessing some information from our database fails, we can catch that in the catch block. So I'm just going to move that to here. And I don't need to pull error off of here. This will be get user sites. As I said, I don't need to do the try catch here. Get user sites, given a user ID, find the sites, filter it down, and return those sites as an object. Okay, that looks fine to me. Let's change this to user sites and then forward in the user ID here. So if this is working correctly, I should now see it where I only see the sites that myself as a user has added. And I've hit an error. Sites.map is not a function. I'm assuming that's because it's expecting that I have data and it's trying to map over those sites, when in reality it looks like sites is probably null. So let's see what's going on here. We'll log out the data that we get back. Undefined, undefined, and then we get our sites. If there's no data, it should be returning this shell. So I'm confused how it's if data.sites is not null, it should not be rendering the site table. Interesting. Oh. So I have I have sites and then sites as a nested object. So somewhere along the line here I screwed this up. And I think it's because in my database function, this is returning an object with sites. So this needed to be pulling off that sites, or we could just return that directly inside of here. Because like I said, this is actually an object with a key of sites. Let's try this. That was it. That was it. So it looks like, just quickly looking at these sites, I'm pretty sure this is working because these are the only sites that I myself have added personally and no other sites. So now I would expect if, let's say I tried to access this, but I put in some kind of bogus token, Firebase is definitely going to throw an error here because it can't decode this JWT. So let's try that out. Nice. So Firebase through our API route through a 500 saying decoding this Firebase ID token failed. So that's great. That means our try catch is working as expected. If there's an error with this, then it will properly catch that. And we'll probably, further along as we start building out the logging and error handling portion of this, we're going to add in some logs here so that we can have observability into when that is happening inside of our application. And we know if things are going wrong in production. But this is a pretty good start. One other thing I'm thinking about is when I go to add a site, I used the mutate function on SWR to update the cached sites back from our API route. And since we've changed how we're calling this function, I believe we're going to need to do something very similar in the other place where we call use SWR. I think it is in, let's see. Yes, in this add site modal, we import mutate from SWR and we say API sites and we modify that with the newly added sites. So I think we should just be able to pass in. At this point, when you're calling the add site modal, you're going to be logged in, and we don't need necessarily to have a check of whether the user is logged in or not. And we should, yeah, we already have context of a user here. So we can just do auth.user.token. That looks good to me. Let's just test this and make sure that it is still working. I'll just close this and let's say my new test. So I see the confirmation dialog and I see that the mutate worked as expected because our new site is showing up here as expected. Let's make sure the feedback pages are still working. Nice. So these are still working as I would expect. Shout out to everybody who's leaving feedback here besides myself. I'm glad that that is still working as I would expect. Okay, so that accomplishes a decent chunk of what we wanted to do. We're only showing the sites for our user. So we have context of our user and our API route. That worked out pretty smoothly. Enforced authentication on API routes. We are now doing that by verifying the ID token. So if I try to call this and I am not logged in or I'm not a verified user, then it won't work. Let's move on to redirecting to the dashboard page if you are already logged in. So I was reading a really interesting article about doing simple auth with Magic and Next.js. And this Magic link is really interesting. It allows you to do passwordless login. And at the bottom of this, one thing I found was really interesting was this piece right here. If I land on the index route and I'm already authenticated, we want users to get automatically redirected to the dashboard page. So by putting this script directly in the head, it gets to execute really fast right when you hit that page and makes that seamless transition over to the dashboard page for people already logged in. And this is actually how Vercel's website works as well. If you try to go to vercel.com, but that cookie is already in place, it will direct you to the dashboard. So I'd like to try and do something like this. To do this, what we're going to need to do is save a cookie. And if that cookie exists, then we can pretty much just copy this code. So I'm going to take this and just close everything here. Command KW closes all tabs. And then if I go back to our index, we actually already have the next head here. We were setting up the title of the page. So I'm just going to paste this inside of here. Hit save. That formatting is kind of weird. That's a little better. Okay, so if we have a cookie and that cookie includes fast feedback off, then we want to redirect to the dashboard. So now we just need to set that cookie, and let's do that inside of our auth file. Now there's a few different ways that you could do this. The library that I've used before is called JS Cookie. I'm sure there's a couple others that are doable. But basically you can just say cookies.set, you give it a key and you give it a value. I'm gonna restart our server here. So after we handle our user, we get our raw user, we create that user, what we can then do inside of here is call that cookie function. So something like cookie, we'll import this from JS Cookie, and we want to set that. The key was fast feedback off, and then the value will be I wonder if we can just do a Boolean instead of a string. I'm not entirely sure. We might have to just do, well, we'll try it. Another thing I want to do for this is I want to say that expires in a day. If this doesn't work, then we can just stringify that value. And then one other thing we want to do is, delete a cookie too when we log out. So let's do, after setting our user, we'll do cookie.remove, can't type. and fast feedback off. So if this works successfully, we should see our cookie set to true. It will expire in a day. And if that is valid, we'll redirect. And then when logging out, it should remove that cookie. Okay, where are we at here? I'm gonna go back to our dashboard or our home page. Can't read property set of undefined. I wonder if that got imported wrong. Yeah. Sometimes my auto import extension will assume that things are a named export when in reality they're the default export, and then it screws everything up. So yeah, that just needed to be changed. So if we go over to our application tab and we look at our cookies, nice. We see a cookie with the key of fast feedback off, value of true, and it expires tomorrow. So this looks great. If I refresh the page, nice, awesome. Wow, that was actually a lot easier than I expected it to be. So if we refresh the page, we get redirected to our dashboard. And if I go back to this route, I guess on a hard refresh, it's always going to bring me back. Maybe I can, if I soft navigate back, no, it's always going to do that now. Okay, let's delete this. There we go. Okay, so that looks good. Let's make sure that logging out also gets rid of this cookie. Nice. Perfect. And just for demonstration purposes, I want to make sure logging in still works. It does. Okay, perfect. So that's still working as I would expect. If I try to go to our index route, it gets redirected back. Awesome. That checks off redirecting to our dashboard if we're already logged in. Let me see how we're doing. We are doing excellent. Let's try out incremental static regeneration. This is something that I have read a lot about, I've researched a lot, but I haven't actually had a great opportunity to put it into production for an application that I was building, and I'm really pumped to get to try this out. So incremental static regeneration essentially allows us to circumvent the issue of rebuilding our application every time by having to kick off a new rebuild. So instead, a new request will come in, and in the background, our page will be rebuilt, and then the cached version of our static site will be updated with the newest version. So if I mentioned at the start, on the fast feedback website right now in prod, all of those statically generated files are out of date. And that's because when using getStaticProps and getStaticPass, it's happening at build time. So if I go look at the feedback right here, the last feedback I see is on June 28th. Now, unless I go in and trigger a full rebuild of our site, I'm not going to see this update because it's not going to create a new static version of our site. So with incremental static regeneration, we allow Vercel and Next.js to take care of this for us. So by using this unstable revalidate flag, it will wait at most once every second. If a new request comes in, it will regenerate that page, and when it's finished successfully building, it will get updated in the cache and we'll see the new version. So I really want to do this on our feedback pages so that we have the most up-to-date information. So if we go to, it was like P and the site ID, for get static props, that's actually fetching the feedback for that site. What we want to do is then throw on unstable revalidate, and we want to do 1 second. So when we're developing locally, right, if I were to go to the feedback for my site, when we're developing locally, get static props and get static paths are running on every reload. So it's not an accurate simulation of what that's going to look like when it gets deployed, because you're only going to be serving up the statically generated files in site. So this is looking good. If I were to leave a comment like hello world, testing locally, I leave a comment, we're still seeing that mutation happen instantly. And when I refresh the page, I'm also going to see this instantly because I'm doing it locally, and the entire static site is getting rebuilt. But like I said, when I'm deployed, I'm not seeing those. So if we take this and deploy this, we should then see every second that get updated. So to do that, I am going to quickly review the lot of changes that I have inside of this change. By the way, if you don't use the Git features built into VS Code, I would highly recommend them. They've made my life a lot easier. Don't need this console log. Oops. Okay. So I'm going to use the command line to deploy this one, just because I'm not ready to open up the pull requests yet. But you can really do this either way, whatever works best for your workflow. So now this will spit out a deployed version of our application using the preview environment variables, and we should be able to see it update after a second if a new request comes in. One other piece I wanted to mention is that in the process of Zeit being rebranded to Vercel, they switched out their preview URLs from .now.sh to .vercel.app. So as I was testing a few days ago, I had to go into my application settings inside of Firebase and add in the authorized domain for vercel.app as well. So if you're trying to build along with this, you might run into that issue. I wanted to make sure I mentioned this just so that you know that those URLs are now changing. Okay, so we don't need this anymore. One other piece I wanted to talk about as I'm letting this build is Firebase security rules. If you go back here, in the docs for verifying ID tokens, it says that many of the things that you would do this, you can actually accomplish through security rules for either real-time databases or cloud storage. And this is something that I didn't know a lot about, but I actually explored a little bit. And basically, Firebase's intention with these security rules is to simplify the process of understanding not only authentication, I am who I say I am, but authorization, which is me as Lee has access to specifically my sites or specifically this other piece of data, the role-based piece. And they do this through a JSON file that you can configure inside of your Firebase project. If you created it, Firebase project, you probably had something set up that allowed read and write rules for, I think it's like a few months out of the gate. And before you go to production, you want to lock this down so that nobody can. You don't want to allow everyone to be able to write to your database. And that's something that we're probably going to touch on a little bit later, is how to also lock down specific pieces of information with these Firebase rules. But without further ado, our URL has deployed. And if I go view my dashboard, I am seeing only my sites. Again, very good news. And if I go to view feedback, I'm seeing the local changes I made. This will say, does static regeneration work? So if I leave this comment, obviously it's going to happen right away. But now as a second passes and I refresh the page, I'm not going to see that comment right away. And that's because it always serves up the most fresh cached version of the site. So what's on the CDN right now. Now in the background, what's happening is my site is getting rebuilt. I didn't have to do anything. It's getting rebuilt, the cache is getting invalidated, and the new version of this page is getting uploaded to Vercel's CDN. And when I refresh the page, now I see I have my brand new comment show up with a completely static site generated. So this works really good. One thing that I'm still debating and exploring in my head is that is that a good enough user experience? I'm wondering how frequently it would be that somebody would try to refresh that page and see that comment there right away and not be able to wait a couple seconds. One thing I'm exploring is maybe we only take this approach for the routes that will be embedded on a website. So for example, right, like this piece right here is going to be embedded in someone else's site. Maybe the page where you view all the feedback inside of the context of fast feedback, that will do some other sort of data fetching so that it's always fresh. Maybe we do server-side rendering for that piece. But the key piece with static rendering and why we want to do that on the pages that are embedded is so there's no downtime. Like that was the great thing about this. If our server would have been down for some reason, if Firebase would have had an outage and that rebuild would have failed, we would have been fine. We would have never been shipping a broken page to our users, which I think is the biggest advantage of doing something like this. Now we're guaranteed to have a page that is statically served and our users will never not see comments. So I'm pretty happy with this approach. I'm pretty happy with using the static regeneration. And I know that one of the other pieces on the roadmap is allowing like some kind of webhook based triggering to rebuild your site. So maybe, for example, I didn't want to do something that was every second. Maybe I wanted it to rebuild every minute or two. But if somebody leaves a comment, I wanted to kick off that rebuild immediately. We could then make a request to that webhook to kick off the rebuild of our website. That's another piece that I want to explore that I'll probably start to look into more as I build out more pages with this. Let me check on the stream, see how we're doing on time. We're doing decent. One other thing that we can start looking at that we probably won't finish, but I want to get started on, is if I go back to our dashboard and I restart my server, you'll see that I have this dashboard shell. So I'm going to open up this file. And I have a logo, I have some sites, and I have some feedback. One thing that I haven't done yet that I will need to do is create a page that is listing out all of the different feedback. So similar to how we have this API route of getting all of the sites for a given user, we're also going to want to be able to get all of the feedback for a user. So right now this API route is getting the feedback for a specific site, but we will probably also do this by user ID. And that's, excuse me, that's probably a good candidate for next stream. But overall, I'm really happy with the progress that we're making. I'm really looking forward to setting up Stripe and setting up errors handling and logging and starting to finalize some of these pieces and get it actually shipped out to some beta users. So with that, if there's any questions in the chat, feel free to let me know if you want a little more clarification on anything that we've covered in this stream. But I want to kind of tie off where we're at right now in this module in handling Firebase authentication on API routes. Hopefully it was very enjoyable and everyone learned something new. And in the next stream, we're going to start talking about how to build out this feedback page and polish off some of the loose ends that we've created so far. So thank you so much and stay tuned for the next stream.